The basis of today's lecture actually gets away from some of the strategy and looks at some of the theory for how some of this, how crisis is done in this capacity. Um, I want to get into a little bit of framing and agenda setting when we talk about media relations. We'll talk about exemplification. These are two theories that aren't in the book, but then get into apologia, image restoration. I might not go through all of these just for kind of the sake of time, but I do want to talk a little bit of a couple of these, especially when it comes to media versus um, actual organizational theories. So they differ a little bit in that capacity. So let's go ahead and get started. And I start off with agenda setting and framing. Now, these are two pretty interesting theories when it comes to how we look at mass media coverage. The first thing to consider is that when we're dealing with mass media coverage, we're not looking at it in a perspective that this is, quote, the media. That is usually a term I'm not a huge fan of because there is no such thing as the media. There are mass media outlets um, that cover things differently. And so when we look at things like agenda setting, we start to say what is important to that specific media outlet. So when you say the media and when you say what's important to the media, then what we're basically implying is that all media outlets have the same agenda, which is not the case. It never has been the case, uh, except in very early times of television where that could have been more true because there wasn't as much to cover. The main stories were very much shared within public agenda as well as political agenda as well as media agenda. We can see that like back in the 1960s when there's only a couple news stations out there. I think if memory serves correctly, when it came to what is important to the public and to mass media outlets, what came about in this particular study was that 4 out of the 5 studies that public versus mass media outlets thought were important matched. Okay, so this is back in the 60s, okay? Nowadays, when we're looking, I mean, even as far as the 2000s on, so this is 20 years of this going on. The study that kind of broke that a little bit was now that we're dealing with so many news outlets and so many the emphasis of social media, a lot has changed into where 1 of 5 major news stories is matched between the public and um, mass media outlets. And that's huge because, and you can probably get this idea of what's important because, right now, COVID is still very much an important topic. Black Lives Matter is still very much an important topic, and they're circulated within um, the media's agenda. They're saying this is important to talk about, and of course, it's important to talk about. But where it comes into play is we start to look a little bit into what about afterwards? What about after those two very salient, and the key word is salient, which is just a very nice word for being important. Um, what occurs in terms of what's salient after those two stories? And this is where things get a little jumbled in terms of what you think is important to be talking about right now. And so we're starting to look at that in the case of agenda setting. So, agenda setting, again, really gets into this notion of what do mass media outlets find important? And that's going to differ from place to place because you'll have national news that find it a different way. You'll have statewide news that have things that are very important to them. You'll have um, local news, within the city or town that you live in. So right now, I mean, even subdivisions within COVID, for instance, the news in Massachusetts, who's handling COVID very well, is going to be much different of that of Texas right now. Who like recently, I read somewhere that their MLS team couldn't participate because of all the cases of COVID that have occurred within the state. So this is major, and this is something that someone in Texas might say, while it may be salient in Massachusetts, It's very much way more salient here because we're talking about it more and we're dealing with more cases as it is right now. So that's agenda setting in a small nutshell is this idea of what do we consider important? Now that we've established that, what is it about those things that are important? So now we get into what's called media framing. So media framing, it depends on the definition you're looking at, but the one that I've always kind of subscribed to is this idea that mass media outlets cover a news story through four different ways: emphasis, elaboration, selection, and exclusion. And I'm going to go over all four of those and how they pertain to what we're talking about here. So, first and foremost, we look at emphasis. What is the focal point of that story? Okay, so this is a real interesting trick for journalists to be able to think about is what is it that you want the story to be about versus what the organization is talking about. I always personally like journalists, for myself who've been interviewed a number of times, to go in with an idea, but whoever's being interviewed is the subject at hand, and you work around what's being said there, which is really important. Some people go in with their idea and they go right through. So if the person that you're interviewing doesn't have a lot to say about it, or has their own way of saying it, then what occurs is they just keep going with whatever that emphasis of that frame is. And that's in that selection. So they select it and they emphasize that particular thing. So, which is fine. You can do it either way. But at the same time, you do limit yourself for interview purposes, in that case, for what you're trying to look at. But again, there is the essence of being able to come in with a story. Why does this matter to crisis? The big thing about this is how do you want to have a story going in when you're interviewing organizations about what's going on? Do you want to give them the benefit of the doubt? If you are a PR representative, one of the best things that you can do is establish good media relations. I mentioned this yesterday. And what that helps do is, again, you can have an established opportunity to talk to a a journalist and say, hey, look, this is what's going on. We're going to keep you updated. Everything is under control, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the kind of things that help in terms of making sure that the people who are viewing you, which is the public, see you in a better light, because journalists have a lot of that power through what's being said. Because one of the other areas within media framing is this exclusion. So it's not so much what you're saying, it's what you're not saying. Back in the days of the 6 o'clock news, for instance, you only had an hour to cover this. So you couldn't cover all that was promoted there. You just couldn't. There wasn't enough time on there within that hour. So you had to improvise, and you had to do things that you had to say what makes this cut and what doesn't. Well, when you're getting into somebody's opinion about something, cutting things gets tricky. And especially in a crisis, you want to make sure that all the details are up and going. So, when we look at crisis cases, if something is excluded, so like for instance, I did a research thesis on the Duke Lacrosse rape scandal back in 2005. And one of the things that occurred, now I didn't cover this part, but it's just within the story, was hiding DNA evidence and not reporting them. That's a big deal. And it was something that media organizations, rightfully so, didn't cover because they weren't aware of it going on. And it shifted the message once that was found. And it hurt Mike Nifong in his career as a district attorney in this case. So, again, what we're dealing with here, the exclusion, emphasis, and elaboration, that's another one, is how much do we focus on a particular area within this topic? So this is super important. Not only do we select it, not only do we emphasize it, we keep talking about it. What is it about within this one specific piece of rhetoric that makes the cut here? So it emphasizes how a crisis is framed, or as if it's important at all. Like, do we even need to talk about it? So I don't know if y'all have ever. Okay, this is kind of a trivial example. I don't know if y'all have ever seen the movie Chef, Johnny Favreau. Uh, I love the movie, but one of the things it does is he goes through kind of a personal crisis of himself where he gets uh, very much in this state where he's talking to a food critic. He gets really upset with him, yells at him, and it gets caught on the internet. It's like enough said. And he's talking to an agent where she's like, um, he, he's kind of going, I want to get this video taken down. And she goes, you can't get it taken down. It's over. You're on the internet. You are going to be known for this. Regardless of what you think or not. And he goes, well, damn, isn't there anything I can do? Which, oddly enough, there is something that can be done. Is this consideration that the agent says, well, the thing is, there's so much stuff, there's so much media clutter that it could fall by the wayside in a heartbeat because, when we're talking about this whole notion of being seen, there's so many people being seen and so many people that are going under these allegations and so forth about wrongdoings, things that they said were wrong, etc., etc. That's kind of where the valence comes in, if it's positive or negative, or if it's important. And what usually happens is if you're not bringing attention to it, sometimes it goes away. That's not always the case, and I do not recommend that. This is not my endorsement for that. But in his case, yeah, laying low was a good idea. Issuing you can look at it from issuing a response and then laying low, doing good things to where it kind of becomes word of mouth. Gets into good exposure. So that's just something to think about. Focuses on news reporting and then features messages by both media and organizations designed to frame the crisis. It's got to be a collaborative effort, and that just doesn't happen all the time. But good journalists and good PR representatives work together in terms of framing it in such a way, not that it makes the company look good per se. For the company, they would love that. But for all intents and purposes, it's just how the truth is being talked about. And this is extremely important when it comes to how we want to talk about the idea of what should be covered. And it should be the truth. That's hard, but it is something to consider. All right, so that's framing. There is also priming that comes along within the realm of framing. And basically what that kind of alludes to is how things make a resurgence in people's minds. So sometimes media coverage comes back in terms of what you're talking about. So when you are referring to a media study a while ago and it circulates back, this happens again a lot. I can actually post one of my articles up there about shootings. So how many times that, in this case, we were doing the Aurora, Colorado shooting, and how much Virginia Tech or Columbine came up in national versus local coverage. And what we were really trying to get into and try to understand was this whole notion of local, state, and national news and how gun control at the time was being covered. Now, since then, obviously, and unfortunately, there have been way more mass shootings. And so what comes out of that priming message is what's still remembered from previous instances. And so when we talk about this frame of gun control, this might come up where we talk about previous shootings and said, this has to stop. This has to stop. So these are all notions of what we get into with framing. So the next theory that I want to get into is what's called exemplification. And I might stop on this at the end of this theory. But I do want to talk about this one today, especially, is this whole idea within exemplification. This is very much I don't want to say it's a media theory because it's not, but mass media outlets work with exemplification quite a bit. And it doesn't stem from, but it really accents another theory, which is called cultivation theory. Cultivation theory was this theory that came out of 1980, and it basically first said that television is the most innovative piece of mediated technology. Nothing will ever be able to do what it does. now, now that the internet here, it seems that it's a little bit outdated in this case. But it basically says there are people that have high viewership and low viewership of television. And the way people that are high viewers view the world versus low viewers is going to be conceptually different because of how much they watch. They might see a particular area of the country to say, this is very dangerous to go to this place, versus low viewers might not see it that way. My favorite example of this was I was talking to a good friend of mine, a colleague of mine who was from Nigeria. And so she said, I like looking at international cultivation or exemplification, aka what do we remember of these places based on the media that we watch. And she said, in your own words, can you describe to me what Africa would look like to you? And so I would sit there and go, well, I don't know that much about it. I've never been there. I know about how movies frame it, which is, the Sahara, the savannah, a lot of wildlife and so forth. And she very matter of factly, as we were talking about this, she goes, yeah, I've been camping once. She's like, I'm from the capital city of Nigeria. She's like, I'm very much a city related person. And so everything that you talk about within the savannah, for instance, I've seen none of that. Which when you get into this, you start to understand a little bit about how much influence of what you view comes into play here. And vice versa. She mentioned now conversely, when she was saying when I was coming to the United States. By the way, this is when I was in grad school at North Dakota State, Fargo, North Dakota. Just letting you know, our tallest building in the state, I think, is like 10 stories. Just throwing that out there. It's a very rural area of the country, and so she told me, like, she was like, I watched all these movies about American culture to where I saw, New York and Seattle and San Francisco and, all these big Dallas, all these big cities, Chicago. And she's like, I got to Fargo and she's like, where are all the big buildings? um, and it is not to say Fargo is a lovely place. But at the same time, yeah, it does not match what your idea of it is because it's what you've seen. So, cultivation kind of gets that. And it also gets into this, the more we watch, the more mean we think the world is. And I say that very specifically because there's a tenet within cultivation theory. It's called mean world theory, aka if you are a higher viewer of television, you're going to think the world is a lot meaner than it actually is. So, but where another theory called exemplification comes in, which one of my colleagues said it does everything that cultivation does, except that it's better. Exemplification in this day, it kind of stems from cultivation, but it basically states we choose examples from what's called availability heuristics. Availability heuristics are mental shortcuts that it's hard to have your brain on all the time. As you're watching this video, you might be sitting here, doing whatever else you might be doing. But where this comes in is when you're listening to it, when you're studying, you may not remember everything. So we develop intentionally and unintentionally mental shortcuts to help us remember things. Where that comes in is very much how we get into a message and what we remember from it. So there might be something that elicits a really high emotional response, whether it be fear or whether it be joy, whether it be like laughter or something. This is why, scary movies and comedies really stick with us, but only for a short period of time. And when I say that, I mean the fear of it goes away after subsequent views. Well, that's exemplification, but it also gets into this area of, I remember a lot of these things about scary movies when I'm younger. I don't, like I've watched them afterwards and I'm like, I'm not scared of this as much as I was on the first time. But there are things about it that scare me to this day about how things are portrayed. So it does three basic tenets within exemplification and availability heuristics. One, it emphasizes how audience assess portrayals, how we use our cognition for when we're viewing things. So it's very much, again, when we get a high illicit response for something, we may feel very strongly about that. And emotion is tied with that description. Second, it focuses on a brief and simple, memorable message. This is so elaboration likelihood model within the peripheral route of things that when we're viewing everything, we're trying to get it in bite size. We're trying to get it in something that is easy to digest. It's something that is memorable. You might have like quotes, maxims, colloquialisms that stick out to you that you might say, this is like a quote that I really love. And it works because, we might take it and say, hey, this is a quote that I really love, but I'm going to apply it in my daily life in this case. And that's very much availability heuristics and how exemplification works. Where this deals with media, and especially crisis, is what are some of the key messages that were mentioned among public relations, amongst journalists, about how something is being framed, and how much do we go with that narrative based on what's being said. So even if there's another outlook to it, we might stick to the one that we say, this actually makes a lot of sense to me, as well as I can get it because it's very memorable. And then the third part of exemplification in this case is messages that may include any kind of framing of a story. So again, where cultivation gets into this, the more we watch, the more we feel a certain way. Exemplification says it doesn't matter how much you watch, but more about how memorable it was and how that fires within your availability heuristics, your mental shortcuts, to where you could say, I can, there's certain things that I only have to watch once and I can almost recite from memory because it was so impactful about what was being said. And so when those narratives shift from one to another, so like, give you a weird example, is the Wendy's that had a finger that was found in somebody's chili. When we view this for the first time, you might say, "Holy crap, that is horrifying." What a weird example and just an absolute disgusting and disturbing image to see. And so very much exemplification. You would only have to hear that once for that to be stuck into your brain. You would not have to see that over and over and over again to be like, you know what, that finally stuck. No, it would be there right off the bat because it's so horrifying. But where that comes in is where the framing of the story comes in. When we see it for the first time, we might say it as, this sounds just absolutely horrific. However, it turns out that the Wendy's finger in the chili is an elaborate hoax and never was actually something that was Wendy's fault. It was just somebody trying. I've mentioned like twice now already in this lecture series that somebody was just looking for money. And so they put in their own sample of what I don't think it was their finger. I think it was just one that they had. I'd have to look it up. But it is something that once that frame changed, the exemplification changed. But the weird thing is some of it didn't. There are stories that go so far that it's at the point of no return. I think my personal favorite, and I'll stop after this, and this doesn't have anything to do with crisis, but you can kind of get where I'm going with this, is the person who wrote up the study about alpha dogs, for instance, pack alpha dogs, had later recanted and said, no, this was actually a parent. So this actually isn't a thing. Alphas aren't a thing. But the message has spread and spread and spread to the point where, it's nomenclature. It's commonplace now that we know this to be true, even though it's, at least from the person who wrote the initial study said it's not anymore. So these are areas where sometimes, regardless if you have exonerated yourself of false charges, sometimes that still sticks, and that's really unfortunate if that's the case. Luckily, in the case of the two examples within Pepsi and Wendy's that I've mentioned already, of these horrific things that were found in their packaging and product, it turned out to be an elaborate hoax, and they made a recovery from it. From that organization standpoint, that's a good thing for them. So anyway, for next class period, so getting into um, Wednesday, we'll talk a little bit about image restoration, diffusion, apologia, and excellence theory. So until then, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all tomorrow. Thanks.